My wife stopped me from visiting my ailing mother, but secretly traveled to see her ex. She came home to divorce papers waiting for her. For most of my life, I believed loyalty was the foundation of any relationship, a value my parents had lived by and instilled in me. They weren't perfect people, but they were unwavering in their commitment to each other and their family. At 34, I thought I had built something similar with Lila, my wife of 6 years. Sure, we had disagreements like any couple, but I'd always believed that at the core of it all, we had each other's backs. That belief shattered one cold Thursday evening when I got the call about my mom. The doctor's voice was calm but urgent, the kind of tone that makes your stomach drop. "You might want to come in soon," he said. My mom had been fighting a heart condition for years, but hearing those words still hit me like a freight train. I hung up and walked into the living room, where Lila was perched on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees, tapping away at some work email. "Lila," I started, my voice unsteady. "Mom's in the hospital. The doctor says it's serious. I need to go see her." She didn't look up. Her fingers paused for half a second before resuming their rhythm on the keyboard. "We can't afford you missing work right now," she said flatly. Her words took a moment to register. I stood there, dumbfounded, waiting for her to follow up with something. Anything that might acknowledge the gravity of what I just said. But she didn't even glance at me. "Lila, she's really sick," I said, my voice quieter now. She sighed, finally looking up with an expression that was equal parts irritation and exhaustion. "I get that, but you know how tight things are. Missing even a couple of days could mess everything up. Can't you just call her? Or ask your sister to update you?" I stared at her, struggling to process what I was hearing. My mom, who had practically helped raise Lila when her own parents were too wrapped up in their lives to care, was lying in a hospital bed, and all she could think about was work. The air between us grew heavy. I waited for her to take it back, to show even a shred of empathy, but she was already back to typing, as if the conversation was over. "Right?" I muttered, my throat tight. "I'll figure it out." I walked out of the room, feeling something shift inside me. It wasn't just the hurt. It was a realization. This wasn't just about the hospital or my mom. This was about priorities. And for the first time, it hit me how far down I ranked on hers. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over in my head. Was I overreacting? Maybe Lila was just stressed about money. We'd had some big expenses recently. Repairs on the house, her new car. But the nagging feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. The next morning, I called my sister, Emily, to update her on Mom's condition. "Are you coming to see her?" she asked. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she'd been crying. "I'm trying to figure it out," I said, the words bitter in my mouth. I didn't have the heart to tell her what Lila had said. Emily had always idolized Lila, seeing her as the sister she never had. "You need to be here, Nate," Emily said firmly. "Mom needs you. We all do." "I know," I whispered, feeling the weight of my failure. That evening, Lila and I sat down for dinner. The tension between us was palpable, but she acted as if nothing had happened. She chatted about her day, a new project at work, and some drama between her colleagues. I nodded along, barely listening, my appetite gone. Finally, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Do you even care about what's happening with my mom?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She blinked, caught off guard. "Of course I care, Nate. But being there doesn't change anything. You know that, right? It's not like you can fix her condition by sitting in a hospital room. It's not about fixing her," I shot back. "It's about being there for her. For my family. For me." She rolled her eyes, and that small gesture felt like a slap. "I don't understand why you're making this a big deal. We have responsibilities here. You can't just drop everything every time something happens." "Every time?" I repeated, my voice rising. "This isn't just something happening. This is my mom. She could." I stopped, unable to say the words out loud. Lila sighed, pushing her plate aside. "I get it, okay? But life doesn't stop because someone gets sick. You can't let emotions cloud your judgment." Her words echoed in my head long after she'd gone to bed. For the first time in our marriage, I felt a rift between us that I didn't know how to bridge. It wasn't just her refusal to support me. It was the coldness in her tone, the complete lack of understanding. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, staring at my phone, debating whether to book a flight without her blessing. My gut told me that going to see my mom was the right thing to do, but the fear of what it might do to my marriage held me back. In the days that followed, I tried to push the conversation to the back of my mind, focusing instead on work and keeping in touch with Emily for updates. But things with Lila didn't go back to normal. Every interaction felt strained, like there was an invisible wall between us. One night, as I lay in bed next to her, I thought about my parents. My dad had once worked 2 jobs while my mom battled cancer, but he never missed a single appointment or skipped a day by her side when she needed him. That kind of loyalty wasn't just love, it was sacrifice. And it was something I realized Lila wasn't capable of. The crack in our marriage had formed, and though I didn't know it yet, it was only the beginning. 2 days after our argument about visiting my mom, Lila walked into the kitchen with a suitcase in hand and a look that screamed she was bracing for a fight. I was already on edge, trying to manage work while calling my sister every couple of hours for updates on mom. The last thing I expected was for Lila to drop her bombshell. "I need to fly to Denver," she said, her tone almost casual. I looked up from my laptop, confused. "What? Why?" She hesitated for a moment, then leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "Eric's going through some stuff. He really needs someone right now." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her right. "Eric? Your ex, Eric?" "Yes," she replied, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I put my laptop aside and stood up, trying to process what she was saying. "Lila, are you serious? My mom's in the hospital, and you're flying out to see your ex?" "It's not what you think," she said quickly, holding up her hand. "He's been struggling with depression. He just went through a bad breakup, and I'm worried about him." My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. "So you're leaving us, to play therapist for your ex-boyfriend?" Her jaw tightened, and she gave me that look she always gave when she thought I was being unreasonable. "Nate, I've known Eric for years. He's a friend, and he needs me. It's not like I'm going there for fun." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "A friend? You've barely mentioned him in the past 6 years, but now, suddenly, he's a priority." Her face flushed, a mix of anger and discomfort. "I can't believe you're being like this. I thought you'd understand." "Oh, I understand," I shot back. "I understand that my mom is fighting for her life. And instead of being here for me, you're hopping on a plane to see another man." Her tone turned defensive, almost annoyed. "You're making this into something it's not. Eric and I have history, yes, but that's all it is, history. He's going through a tough time, and as his friend, I just want to be there for him. Why is that so hard for you to grasp?" I stared at her, my stomach churning. The audacity of it all. The timing, the lack of empathy, the gall to paint me as the unreasonable one. But instead of exploding, I forced myself to take a breath. "Fine. Do what you want, Lila. You always do anyway." She left the next morning. I didn't help her pack, didn't see her off. I just watched her walk out the door, her suitcase rolling behind her like it was just another business trip. As the door clicked shut, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. I spent the day alternating between anger and self-doubt. Was I overreacting? Maybe she was telling the truth, and Eric really did need help. But who flies halfway across the country for an old friend when their spouse is dealing with a family crisis? Something about it felt off. That night, I tried calling her, hoping to clear the air. She didn't answer, so I left a voicemail. "I don't understand why you're doing this right now," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "But I hope you realize how much this is hurting me." Her response came hours later, a short, dismissive text. "I'm fine. Hope your mom is okay. We'll call tomorrow." The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I logged into our shared phone account, something I hadn't done in years. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed answers. The call log told me everything I needed to know. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd been talking to Eric constantly. Late-night calls, hour-long conversations during work breaks, and dozens of texts every day. My stomach turned as I scrolled through the timeline. When she finally called me that evening, I tried to keep my voice steady. "How's Eric?" I asked, my words dripping with sarcasm. "Don't start, Nate," she sighed. "I told you, I'm just here to help." "And how exactly are you helping?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been spending more time talking to him than you have with me." "Why are you checking my call logs?" she snapped, her voice rising. "That's your takeaway?" I shot back. "You're mad because I found out how much time you're devoting to him?" "Jesus, Lila, do you even hear yourself?" She sighed again, but this time her voice softened, almost pitying. "Nate, you're being paranoid. I'm here because he's in a bad place, not because of whatever you're thinking. I'm not going to apologize for helping a friend." A friend. That word echoed in my head long after we hung up. I tried to tell myself that maybe I was being irrational, that maybe she really was just trying to help someone she cared about. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. The next morning, I called Emily to check on Mom. "She's stable," Emily said, her voice tired. "But she keeps asking about you. Are you coming soon?" I felt a pang of guilt. I hadn't even booked a flight yet, too consumed by the chaos with Lila to focus on what really mattered. "I'll try," I promised, knowing it sounded hollow. As I hung up, I looked around our empty house. It felt colder without Lila there, but instead of missing her, all I felt was resentment. She had made her choice, and it wasn't me or my family. For the first time, I began to wonder if this was the beginning of the end. If the crack in our marriage wasn't just a fracture, but the start of something much bigger. Something that couldn't be repaired. Lila had been gone less than 24 hours when I made up my mind. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for her to validate what was important to me. My mom needed me, and I wasn't going to let her down. Not this time. First thing Monday morning, I called my boss. I explained the situation, my voice carefully measured as I laid out my case for an emergency leave. To my relief, he was understanding. "Family comes first," he said, almost like a pointed reminder. It stung more than it should have. By that afternoon, I was on a flight to my hometown. As the plane descended, I looked out the window and felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in weeks. Lila wasn't here to talk me out of this, to make me second-guess myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something purely for me and the people I loved. Walking into my mom's hospital room hit me harder than I'd expected. She looked so small, her once lively face pale and sunken. Emily was already there, holding her hand, and her eyes lit up when she saw me. "You made it," she said softly, standing to hug me. "I didn't think you would." "Of course I did," I replied, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay composed. Mom stirred as I sat by her bedside, her eyelids fluttering open. Her smile was weak but genuine. "Nate," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You didn't have to come." "Yes, I did," I said, squeezing her hand. For the next 2 days, I stayed by her side, splitting time between her room and quick coffee breaks with Emily in the cafeteria. Being there reminded me of who I used to be. The man who didn't think twice about showing up when it mattered, before Lila's constant pragmatism dulled my instincts. Lila's absence, meanwhile, felt like a ghost hovering over every moment. I kept checking my phone, half expecting her to call or text with some acknowledgement of what I was doing. But when her messages did come, they were painfully generic. "Hope your mom's doing okay. Flight was fine. Eric says hi." "Eric says hi?" I stared at my phone, feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. I replied with a simple thanks and left it at that. Our calls were worse. She always seemed rushed, her voice distant, like she was talking to me out of obligation. "I can't talk long," she'd say. "Eric's going through a lot, and I don't want to leave him hanging." Her words burned. Leave him hanging? I was the one holding my family together while she was off playing Florence Nightingale for a man who wasn't her husband. One night, after another cryptic text from Lila, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened our shared phone account again, my heart pounding as I logged in. It felt wrong, invasive even, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't let me rest. And there it was. The call logs told a story I didn't want to read. Over the past week, she'd spent more time on the phone with Eric than she had with me in a month. Late-night calls that stretched into the early hours, back-to-back texts throughout the day. I scrolled further, the evidence piling up, each timestamp a punch to the gut. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she really was just trying to help him through a tough time. Maybe she felt guilty for not being able to do more. But the sheer volume of communication between them told a different story. When Emily found me in the hospital waiting room later that night, I must have looked as bad as I felt. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting beside me. "Nothing," I said quickly, shoving my phone back into my pocket. She gave me a look, the kind only a sibling can pull off, equal parts skeptical and concerned. "You sure? Because you look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile and changed the subject, but the weight of what I'd found stayed with me. The next morning, I sat with Mom as she ate a small breakfast, her strength slowly returning. "You should go home, Nate," she said between bites. "You've done more than enough here. I'm not leaving until I know you're okay," I insisted. She smiled, her eyes soft. "Lila must be missing you." I froze, unsure how to respond. "She's busy," I said finally, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Mom nodded, too tired to press the issue. But her words stuck with me. Was Lila missing me? Did she even care that I was gone? Or was she too busy with Eric to notice? The day before I was set to fly home, I called Lila again. This time, I didn't bother pretending everything was fine. "How's Denver?" I asked, my tone sharper than usual. "Exhausting," she replied with a sigh. "Eric's a mess. I've barely had time to sleep." "And what about us?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice defensive. "I mean, do you even care about what's happening here?" About Mom? About me? Nate, I'm here for a reason. I told you. Eric needs me right now. I'm sorry if that's hard for you to understand, but it's the truth. Her words hung in the air like a final nail in the coffin. Right? I said quietly. I'll see you when you get back. I hung up before she could respond, my hands trembling. For the first time, I wasn't just angry, I was done. I spent the flight home in silence, staring out the window as the miles between me and my mom grew. But the distance between me and Lila felt even greater. I didn't know what I'd find when I got back, but one thing was certain. Our marriage wasn't the same. And maybe it never had been. Lila came home late in the afternoon, rolling her suitcase through the door like she'd just returned from a business trip. She dropped it by the stairs and looked around the living room until her eyes landed on me, sitting on the couch. "How was Mom?" she asked casually, her tone light, almost cheerful. I stared at her, my emotions teetering between disbelief and rage. Her voice was so normal, so devoid of guilt or acknowledgement of what she had done, or hadn't done, for that matter. For a second, I wondered if she was testing me, seeing how far she could push before I snapped. "She's stable," I replied, my tone deliberately even. "Doctors are optimistic, but it's going to be a long road." "That's good," she said, nodding. "I'm glad you got to see her." She didn't mention the argument we'd had before she left, didn't apologize for her refusal to go with me. Instead, she acted like she'd done me a favor by giving me permission to be there. I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but I held back. I needed to keep my head clear. "Eric's doing better," she added, moving toward the kitchen. It was good for him to have someone to talk to. I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to ask why that someone had to be her. Instead, I nodded and muttered, "That's good," before retreating to the sanctuary of silence. That evening, we ate dinner together, the conversation stilted and forced. She talked about her flight, the weather in Denver, and some generic details about Eric's recovery, as if she were recounting a weekend with an old friend and not a man she'd been prioritizing over her own husband. After we cleaned up, Lila announced she was going to take a shower. "It's been such a long day," she said with a dramatic sigh, grabbing her toiletry bag and heading upstairs. As soon as I heard the water running, I moved. Her suitcase was still sitting by the stairs. I knelt beside it, hesitating for a moment. The thought of going through her things made me feel sick, like I was crossing some invisible line. But then I remembered the call logs, the rushed conversations, the dismissive texts while I was at my mom's bedside. I unzipped the main compartment and sifted through her clothes, finding nothing unusual at first. But when I opened the side pocket, my breath caught. There they were, glossy, printed photos, the kind you'd get from a drugstore photo kiosk. I pulled them out slowly, my hands shaking. The first picture showed Lila and Eric sitting on a beach, their legs casually brushing against each other. They were both laughing, their faces relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen on Lila in years. The second photo was worse. Eric had his arm draped around her shoulders, his face close to hers as if whispering something. And then there was the third. In the final photo, Lila was leaning back against Eric, her head resting on his chest as they gazed out at the ocean. It wasn't just friendly, it was intimate. My chest tightened as I stared at the images, my mind racing. This wasn't just about her lying. It was about how little she respected me. She hadn't just left me to deal with my mom's illness alone. She had chosen this. By the time Lila came downstairs, freshly showered and wrapped in her favorite robe, I was sitting in the living room with a drink in hand, trying to steady my nerves. "You okay?" she asked, tilting her head like she actually cared. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She didn't press further, just grabbed her phone and settled onto the couch across from me. I watched her scroll through social media, her expression calm and content, as if she hadn't just blown a hole in our marriage. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to throw the photos in her face and demand an explanation. But something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of what she'd say, or worse, what she wouldn't. That night, as we climbed into bed, I could feel the distance between us like a physical barrier. She fell asleep quickly, her breathing soft and steady, while I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. In my mind, I was already drafting a plan. This wasn't a problem I could fix with another argument or a heartfelt conversation. The photos were proof that our marriage wasn't just broken, it was over. But I needed to be smart about how I ended it. Lila was good at spinning things, and making herself the victim. If I wasn't careful, she'd twist this around and make me the bad guy. As I lay there, I made a decision. I would gather everything. The photos, the call logs, the texts. I would confront her, but not until I had the upper hand. This wasn't just about getting answers anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my life, and I wasn't going to let her take that away from me. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of resolve I hadn't felt in weeks. Lila was still asleep, her soft snores breaking the silence of the bedroom as sunlight filtered through the curtains. I got dressed quietly, grabbed my phone, and slipped out of the house. I sat in my car for a moment, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked worn, like I'd aged a decade in just a few days. Taking a deep breath, I opened my phone and searched for local divorce attorneys. The name Matthew Whitaker popped up first, with glowing reviews about his efficiency and straightforward approach. That was exactly what I needed. His office was a sterile, modern space in a nondescript building downtown. The receptionist barely looked up as I explained my reason for being there. "Mr. Whitaker can see you in an hour," she said, sliding a clipboard of forms across the counter. I filled them out mechanically, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say, but unsure where to begin. When I finally sat down across from Matthew Whitaker, he was nothing like I expected. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, with sharp, calculating eyes, he leaned forward as I started my story. I laid it all out. The argument about visiting my mom, the sudden trip to see Eric, the evasive texts and phone calls, and finally the photos. I placed them on his desk, spreading them out like evidence in a courtroom drama. He studied them for a moment before nodding. "This is pretty clear-cut," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Her actions, both emotionally and financially, demonstrate a pattern of disregard for your marriage. If you want to file, we can have the papers ready within days." "Days?" I repeated, surprised by the speed. He shrugged. "When there's this much evidence, it's not hard to build a case. The photos alone speak volumes, but we can also reference her refusal to support you during your mother's illness as further proof of neglect. Judges don't look kindly on spouses who abandon their partners in times of crisis." His words made it real. I wasn't just venting to a friend or ranting in my head anymore. This was a step toward ending everything. "I'm not ready for a fight," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "You might not have to," he replied. "If she sees the evidence and agrees to a settlement, this could be over quickly. But," he added, raising an eyebrow, "if she tries to play the victim or counter with her own narrative, you need to be prepared. People can get ugly when they feel cornered." That night, I couldn't bring myself to lie beside her in the same bed. The weight of what I'd done, of what I was about to do, felt suffocating. After dinner, I grabbed a pillow and blanket and made my way to the guest room. Lila poked her head in as I was setting up. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. "Just need some space," I muttered, avoiding her eyes. "Work's been stressing me out, and I don't want to keep you up if I toss and turn." She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Okay," she said finally. "Just don't let it become a habit, okay?" I nodded, my throat tight, and she walked away. Lying on the too small guest bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the lawyer's words in my mind. Was I really ready to do this? To end 6 years of marriage with a few signatures on a stack of papers? Part of me still wanted to believe there was a way to salvage things, that maybe I'd wake up one morning and Lila would magically be the woman I thought I'd married. But the photos, the call logs, her indifference, they were like a drumbeat in the back of my mind, reminding me that the person I wanted her to be didn't exist. I thought about the moments we'd shared early in our relationship, back when her laugh could light up a room and her touch felt like home. Where had that person gone? Or had she ever been real to begin with? The next morning, Lila acted as though nothing had changed. She kissed me on the cheek before heading to work, humming a tune as she grabbed her keys. "Have a good day," she said, smiling like the perfect wife. "You too," I replied, forcing a tight smile of my own. As the door shut behind her, I felt a wave of relief. With her gone, I could breathe again, focus on what needed to be done. I called Whitaker's office and gave him the green light to draft the papers. "We'll have them ready by Friday," he said. Friday, 3 days away. It felt both too soon and not soon enough. That evening, Lila and I had dinner together, the silence between us louder than any argument we'd ever had. She didn't notice the tension in my shoulders, the way I avoided her gaze, or if she did, she chose to ignore it. "Do you think we should plan a trip somewhere?" she asked suddenly, twirling spaghetti around her fork. "It's been ages since we've had a real vacation." The irony of her suggestion almost made me laugh. A vacation? She'd just returned from her personal getaway, and now she wanted to play house? "Maybe," I said non-committally, knowing full well there wouldn't be another trip in our future, at least not together. That night, I returned to the guest room, and Lila didn't even comment. Maybe she thought I was still clueless, still the same man who had let her brush off his mother's illness and run off to Eric without consequence. She didn't know that the ground beneath her feet was already shifting, that by the end of the week, everything she'd built on her lies would crumble. As I lay in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't second-guessing myself. This wasn't just about leaving her. It was about finally choosing me. Friday morning arrived, heavy with anticipation. Whitaker's assistant had emailed me the finalized divorce papers the night before, and I'd printed them at work, my hands trembling as the printer spat out page after page of my decision. Holding them in my hands, the weight of what I was about to do felt both liberating and crushing. By the time Lila came home from work that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the envelope in front of me. I'd rehearsed the moment a dozen times in my head, but when she walked in, tossing her keys onto the counter with her usual carefree air, my stomach flipped. "Hey," she said, pausing when she saw me sitting there. Her smile faltered. "What's up?" I gestured to the envelope. "We need to talk." Her eyes darted to the envelope, then back to me. "Okay, what's this about?" "Sit down," I said, my voice steady. She hesitated, then pulled out the chair across from me. "Nate, you're scaring me." "What's going on?" I slid the envelope across the table, and she stared at it for a moment before picking it up. The air between us felt thick, suffocating, as she opened it and began flipping through the pages. Her face shifted with every line she read. Confusion, disbelief, and then fury. "What the hell is this?" she snapped, slamming the papers onto the table. I met her glare without flinching. "This is the result of 6 years of me putting you first, and you putting yourself first. I can't do it anymore." For a moment, she just stared at me, as if trying to process the words. Then her expression flickered, shock giving way to anger, and then something that almost looked like regret. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice shaking. "Eric and I didn't do anything. I swear." Her tone wasn't convincing. It wasn't the voice of someone defending the truth. It was the voice of someone panicking, scrambling to regain control. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "You really expect me to believe that? After the calls, the texts, the photos? You left us, to be with him when my mom was in the hospital, Lila. And now you're going to sit here and tell me it was innocent." Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't move me. I'd seen her cry before, used to soften me, to deflect. This time I wasn't buying it. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice rising. "You're going to throw away everything we've built together over a misunderstanding." "Don't," I said sharply, cutting her off. "Don't act like this is my fault. You made your choices. You chose to lie to me. You chose to put him first. This is on you, Lila." She stood abruptly, pacing the length of the kitchen, her hands running through her hair. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Eric was in a dark place. I couldn't just abandon him. He needed me. And what about me?" I countered, my voice rising for the first time. "What about my mom? My family? Did we not need you? Or did that not matter because it didn't stroke your ego the way playing savior to Eric did?" She stopped pacing, turning to face me, her cheeks streaked with tears. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Fair?" I scoffed. "You want to talk about fair? Fair would have been you standing by me when I needed you most. Fair would have been you telling the truth instead of sneaking off to play house with your ex. But you didn't do that, Lila. And now you're reaping what you sowed." She collapsed into the chair, burying her face in her hands. "I never meant for it to get like this," she said, her voice muffled. For a moment, I felt a pang of something, pity, maybe. She looked so small, so defeated. But then I remembered the photos, the calls, the empty bed I'd slept in for the past 3 nights. "I'll give you some time to look over the papers," I said, standing. "But my decision is final. I won't live like this anymore." "Nate," she said, looking up at me, her eyes desperate. "Please, can't we try to fix this?" I shook my head. "You can't fix something that only one person cares about." I left the kitchen, her sobs echoing faintly behind me as I climbed the stairs. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control. It wasn't a victory, not really, but it was a step toward reclaiming my life. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. The confrontation had gone exactly as I'd expected, and yet it still felt surreal. Part of me wondered if she'd fight, if she'd try to paint herself as the victim or come up with some last-ditch effort to save face. But another part of me didn't care. I wasn't doing this for her anymore. The weeks leading up to the court date were a blur. After Lila received the divorce papers, her initial shock gave way to anger, and then to what I can only describe as cold detachment. She didn't try to argue with me again, nor did she attempt to reconcile. Instead, she lawyered up, and the battle lines were drawn. The first sign of her strategy came through my attorney, Whitaker. "She's claiming the photos don't prove anything," he said during one of our meetings. "She's positioning it as you being overly jealous and controlling." I laughed bitterly. Controlling? She left me for a week to go be with another man while my mom was in the hospital? Exactly, he said, nodding. "And we're going to use that." When the court date finally arrived, I walked into the courtroom with a folder clutched in my hands. It contained everything: the photos, the call logs, screenshots of her texts, and even a written statement from Emily about how Lila had refused to support me during Mom's illness. I had never felt so prepared, and yet so exposed. Lila was already seated when I entered, her posture rigid and her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She looked polished, professional even, in a fitted blazer and subtle makeup, but there was a tension in her expression that she couldn't hide. When the hearing began, her attorney opened with a predictably sanitized version of events. Lila, according to him, had simply been a supportive friend to someone in need and had never acted with malicious intent. The photos were framed as misinterpreted moments taken out of context, and her absence during my mom's illness was downplayed as a miscommunication. It was infuriating to listen to, but I kept my composure. When it was my turn, Whitaker presented our evidence with a calm confidence that made me grateful I had chosen him. He laid out the timeline: Lila's refusal to let me visit my mom, her sudden trip to see Eric, the excessive communication, and finally, the photos. The judge's expression remained neutral as he flipped through the pictures. But when Whitaker read out the dismissive text Lila had sent while I was at the hospital, "Eric says hi and hope your mom's okay," I saw his brow furrow ever so slightly. Lila shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. Finally, it was time for her to speak. Her voice was steady at first, as she reiterated the same narrative her attorney had presented. "Eric and I have been friends for years," she said, her tone measured. "There was nothing romantic about my trip. I was just trying to be there for someone who needed support." Whitaker leaned in, his expression unyielding. "Mrs. Calloway, would you consider a beachside embrace with your friend to be appropriate conduct for a married woman?" Lila faltered, her face flushing. "It wasn't like that," she stammered. He was upset, and I was comforting him." "Comforting him," Whitaker repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "While your husband was tending to his critically ill mother?" She glanced at her attorney, searching for an escape, but none came. The final blow came when I took the stand. I spoke plainly, recounting the months of neglect, the emotional toll of her actions, and the moment I realized our marriage was over. "I trusted her," I said, my voice steady. But that trust was shattered when she chose to prioritize another man over her husband and his family. Lila kept her gaze down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When the judge finally delivered his ruling, I felt a strange sense of detachment. He granted me a fair settlement, including a portion of our joint savings, and acknowledged the emotional distress I had endured. Lila was ordered to pay a modest amount toward the legal fees, given the evidence of her actions. It wasn't a victory. It didn't feel like one, at least. But it was closure. As we left the courthouse, Lila avoided my eyes, walking quickly toward her car without a word. I stood on the steps for a moment, watching her retreating figure. This was the woman I had once vowed to spend my life with, now exposed as a stranger. Whitaker clapped me on the shoulder. "You did good," he said. I nodded, but the words felt hollow. Walking out of that courthouse was liberating, but it wasn't joyful. I felt lighter, yes, but also empty. That night, I sat in the quiet of my now half-empty house, staring at the divorce decree on the table. I thought I'd feel relief, maybe even vindication. Instead, I felt the weight of what had been lost, not just the marriage, but the person I had been before all of this. In the days following the divorce, the news spread quickly through our circle of friends and family. It's funny how people seem to thrive on the spectacle of someone else's life falling apart. I receive an onslaught of texts, calls, and unsolicited advice, each interaction more draining than the last. Some people rallied behind me, expressing their sympathy and outrage. "I can't believe she did that to you," my sister Emily said during one of our calls. "You deserve better, Nate. You always did." Others were less supportive, questioning whether I had acted too quickly. "Marriage is hard," an old college friend commented on one of my social media posts about moving forward. "You should have tried harder to work it out." Tried harder. The phrase echoed in my mind every time someone suggested I should have fought for my marriage. What none of them seemed to understand was that I had tried. I tried for years to keep us together, to ignore the growing cracks, to give Lila the benefit of the doubt. But there's only so much you can do when the other person isn't willing to meet you halfway. My mom, though frail, was my rock during this time. I visited her as often as I could, and despite her own struggles, she always made a point of asking how I was holding up. "You did what you had to do," she said one afternoon, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for standing up for yourself." Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. Mom had always been the embodiment of selflessness, putting everyone else's needs before her own. For her to encourage me to prioritize myself felt almost validating. But even with her support, the fallout was hard to navigate. The house felt emptier than ever, and there were nights I lay awake, replaying the past 6 years, wondering if I could have done something differently. Lila, meanwhile, wasted no time rewriting the narrative. She told mutual friends that I had been controlling and that I'd overreacted to her friendship with Eric. The first time I heard one of her twisted versions of events, it was through a mutual acquaintance, Sarah, who called me out of the blue. "I don't want to take sides," she began, her tone cautious. "But Lila told me what happened, and honestly, it doesn't sound as bad as you're making it out to be." "What exactly did she tell you?" I asked, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. Sarah hesitated. "She said you were jealous and insecure, and that Eric was just a friend going through a tough time. She said you blindsided her with the divorce instead of talking things out." I felt my jaw tighten, the familiar surge of anger rising in my chest. But instead of lashing out, I took a deep breath. "Believe what you want, Sarah," I said finally. "But you weren't there. You didn't see what I saw, and you didn't feel what I felt. I'm done defending myself." She muttered something about hoping we could all move on, and hung up. That conversation set the tone for every similar interaction that followed. I realized quickly that no matter how much evidence I had, some people would always see me as the bad guy. And for the first time in my life, I stopped caring. One of the hardest parts was hearing that Lila had turned my pain into her own personal sob story. She posted vague, melodramatic updates on social media about losing herself in a toxic relationship and finding the courage to walk away from someone who didn't value her. It hurt, not because I cared about what strangers thought, but because I knew some of our mutual friends were buying into her narrative. These were people who had once celebrated our love, who had stood by us at our wedding, toasting to what they thought was forever. But I refused to engage. Every time I felt the urge to set the record straight, to post the photos or the call logs as proof of her lies, I reminded myself that I didn't owe anyone an explanation. The truth was ugly, and no amount of social media spin could change what had happened. One evening, Emily called me, her voice unusually tense. "I ran into Lila at the store today," she said. I braced myself, and she tried to make small talk like everything was fine, Emily continued. Then she said she hopes you can work through your issues and that maybe one day you'll be able to forgive her. I let out a bitter laugh. Forgive her? For what? She still won't even admit she did anything wrong. "That's the thing," Emily said quietly. "She doesn't think she did. She's convinced herself she's the victim in all of this." Her words stuck with me long after we hung up. Lila's ability to rewrite reality wasn't new, but it still stung to see how easily she could twist the truth to suit her needs. Over time, the noise began to fade. Friends who had taken sides drifted away, and those who had stuck by me stopped bringing up the divorce altogether. My focus shifted to rebuilding, repairing my relationships with the people who mattered, like my mom and Emily, and rediscovering who I was outside of my marriage. But some nights, when the house was too quiet and the weight of everything pressed down on me, I'd scroll through social media and see one of Lila's posts, smiling selfies with friends, captions about starting over and embracing the journey. And I'd wonder if she ever thought about me, about what she'd done. I knew better than to dwell on it. Lila had always been good at moving on, at compartmentalizing her mistakes and pretending they didn't exist. I, on the other hand, wasn't sure how to move forward yet. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. Months after the dust settled, I realized I was still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. The initial flurry of paperwork and court dates had kept me busy, but now that life had slowed down, I found myself struggling to move forward. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind circling the same questions over and over. Had I failed her? Could I have done more to save our marriage? I decided to try therapy. It wasn't an easy decision. I'd always been the kind of person who believed I could work through things on my own. But the truth was, I was stuck. Every time I thought I was making progress, the doubts and regrets would creep back in, pulling me under. My therapist, Dr. Miller, was a quiet, patient woman who listened intently as I laid out the story of my marriage. I expected her to offer quick solutions or tell me that I'd done the right thing, but she didn't. Instead, she asked questions that forced me to dig deeper than I wanted to. "Do you think Lila's behavior during the divorce was out of character?" she asked during one session. I paused, considering her words. "I don't know," I said finally. "I guess I always thought of her as self-assured, confident. But now, looking back, maybe that confidence was just selfishness disguised as strength." Dr. Miller nodded, encouraging me to continue. "She always put herself first," I admitted. "Her career, her friends, her needs. I just didn't see it for what it was. I told myself it was ambition, that it was part of what made her so independent. But in reality, it was something else." "What do you mean by something else?" Dr. Miller asked. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "She never really prioritized us. Everything had to be on her terms. And I let it happen because I thought that's what compromise looked like. I thought if I just gave her enough space, enough understanding, she'd eventually meet me halfway. And did she?" "No," I said quietly. "She didn't." That realization was a turning point. I began to see that Lila's behavior during the divorce wasn't a sudden change. It was the culmination of years of patterns I had ignored. The way she dismissed my concerns, the way she justified her actions, the way she always seemed to have an excuse for why her needs mattered more than mine. It had always been there. I just refused to see it. But recognizing the truth didn't make it easier. If anything, it made the nights harder. I'd lie awake, replaying old arguments, wondering if I should have fought harder, spoken up sooner, done something differently. One night, as I stared at the darkened ceiling, a memory surfaced. It was from early in our marriage, during one of the few times we'd actually fought. I can't even remember what it was about, but I remember Lila saying, "You're always so willing to bend. Sometimes I wonder if you even have a breaking point." At the time, I'd laughed it off, thinking she meant it as a compliment. Now, years later, those words haunted me. She wasn't admiring my patience. She was testing my limits. And I had failed that test over and over again until there was nothing left to bend. Therapy also forced me to confront my own role in the relationship. It was easy to blame Lila for her selfishness, but I had to admit that I had enabled it. I'd spent so much time trying to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, that I'd ignored my own needs entirely. "Why do you think you stayed so long?" Dr. Miller asked one day. I thought about it for a moment before replying. I think I wanted to believe she'd change. That if I just gave her enough love, enough patience, she'd realize what we had was worth fighting for. And when she didn't, I hesitated. I told myself it was still my job to fix things, to hold it all together, no matter what. Dr. Miller leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Do you think it's possible that you stayed because it was easier to focus on fixing her than to confront what you needed to fix in yourself?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Over the next few weeks, I began to unpack not just my marriage, but the patterns in my own life that had led me there. I realized that I had spent so much time trying to be the good husband that I'd lost sight of what I deserved in return. But even with this newfound clarity, the guilt lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed. Not just Lila, but myself. I'd stayed in a one-sided marriage for too long, hoping against hope that things would change. And in the end, all I had to show for it was a broken heart and an empty house. Still, there were moments of progress. Small victories. Like the day I looked at our wedding photo, the one I'd shoved into the back of a closet after the divorce, and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no longing. Just a quiet acceptance that the man in that picture was gone, replaced by someone older, wiser, and maybe a little stronger. One evening, after a particularly tough session with Dr. Miller, I found myself sitting on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on me. Lila had been a chapter in my life, a long, complicated, often painful chapter. But it wasn't the whole story. And while I didn't know what the next chapter would look like, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't spend it bending myself into someone else's shape. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, I felt like I was finally moving forward. Life now is complicated. It's not the word I would have chosen to describe my life before the divorce, but it fits perfectly now. My days are quieter, lonelier, and yet, in some ways, more peaceful. I've spent months learning how to live on my own again, figuring out who I am without Lila's presence filling the spaces around me. My mom is recovering slowly. She still has her bad days, but she's a fighter. I visit her every weekend, bringing groceries, cooking her favorite meals, and just sitting with her while she shares stories I've heard 100 times before. She doesn't say it outright, but I think she worries about me. She catches me staring off into space sometimes, lost in my thoughts, and will reach over to squeeze my hand. "You're going to be okay," she said recently, her voice firm. "You're stronger than you think." I smiled and nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Some days, I feel like I made the right choice. I remind myself of the betrayal, the photos, the lies, and it's enough to silence the lingering doubts. But then there are other days when the house feels too big, too empty, and I wonder if I could have done more. The loneliness creeps in when I least expect it. I'll be folding laundry or cleaning the kitchen, and something small will trigger a memory. The sound of a laugh on a TV show that reminds me of hers, or the sight of her favorite wine still sitting untouched in the back of the fridge. One night, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone, something I hadn't done in months. I came across a picture of us from our honeymoon. Her arm draped around my shoulder, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in that photo with the one who had walked out on our marriage. Did she miss me? Did she ever regret what she'd done? A few weeks ago, I got my answer, or at least part of it. It was late, and I was sitting on the couch, flipping aimlessly through streaming options when my phone buzzed. I picked it up, expecting another spam message, but froze when I saw her name. "Lila, I'm sorry for everything. I just wanted you to know." That was it. No follow-up, no explanation, just a handful of words that landed in my chest like a punch. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I wanted to ask her what she was sorry for. Was it the lies? The trip to Denver? Or was it something deeper, letting our marriage fall apart without ever trying to save it? But in the end, I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was no going back, no fixing what was already broken. Even if part of me still missed what we once had, I knew the person I missed wasn't the person she had become. These days, I'm trying to focus on myself. Therapy has helped, though the process is slow. I've started going to the gym again, something I neglected during the later years of our marriage, and I've taken up cooking as a hobby. It's therapeutic in a way, following a recipe, creating something from nothing. I've even gone on a few dates, though nothing serious. It's strange trying to connect with someone new when the shadow of my past looms so large. I catch myself comparing them to Lila, wondering if they'll let me down the way she did. But then I remind myself that not everyone is Lila. That there are people out there who value loyalty the way I do, who understand what it means to build a partnership based on mutual respect. Maybe I'll find someone like that someday. Or maybe I won't. For now, all I can do is keep moving forward. Some days, that means diving into work or spending time with my mom. Other days, it's just getting out of bed and taking a walk around the neighborhood. The future is uncertain, but I've learned to make peace with that. Life doesn't come with guarantees, and the only thing I can control is how I choose to live it. As I sit here writing this, I can't say I have all the answers, but I'm learning to let go of the need for closure, for a tidy resolution. Life is messy, and so am I.